Welcome to our webinar, Global North-South Higher Education Partnerships, often staffed with the right intentions, but too often fall short when it comes to impact. I'm Brendan O'Malley, Editor-in-Chief of University World News, and your host for today's session, as we ask what lessons have been learned and what needs to change to make those partnerships more equitable, more collaborative, and more effective. This session is part of our ongoing series supported by ABET, exploring the key challenges shaping higher education globally. And before we bring in our speakers, we'd like to make this session as interactive as possible. You'll see a short poll appearing on your screen now. Just select the option that best describes your role. It should only take a few seconds. Now, we'll be running several polls during the session, and there will be plenty of time for your questions at the end. While you're filling in the poll, let's turn to our panel. I'm very pleased to welcome Ernest Ariichi, Founding Secretary General of the African Research Universities Alliance, former Vice Chancellor of the University of Ghana, and a leading development economist with deep experience in championing research partnerships across Africa and with Europe. Welcome also to Michael Milligan, CEO of ABET, the global accreditation body for higher education. And thank you as well to ABET for partnering with us on this webinar series. ABET partners with quality assurance bodies in India, Africa, and elsewhere to help drive up standards. Also with us is Boris Martin, CEO of Engineers Without Borders USA, whose work in international development has focused on building long-term, locally grounded partnerships across Africa and Latin America that help build local capacity. And finally, we are joined by Damtu Tefera, Professor of Higher Education at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa and Founding Director of the International Network for Higher Education in Africa, who has been deeply critical of North-South partnerships and has recently proposed a global compact in research collaborations to reset how partnerships operate onto a more equitable and robust basis. Now, if we have a look at our polls, we can see that we have 31% university administrators and 17% academics, 10% senior academics, 9% university leaders amongst us, and 5% students. So, welcome everybody. And I'm going to turn first to Damtu with our first question, which is, from your experience, what have you learned about what are the wrong ways to go about North-South partnerships, and what are the better ways to develop them?
Thank you very much, Brendan, for inviting me to participate in this panel discussion on an issue I have been deliberating and writing on for over 3 decades. It started as a PhD thesis ages ago, so I continue to ruminate on this issue. So let me start with the wrong ways, or what I call unproductive ways or approaches first. A wrong partnership is extractive in nature and transactional in practice. Such unproductive acts tend to benefit one group, typically a northern partner, in a kind of excessive and unfair and inequitable manner. Okay, what way is it that it is extractive or transactional? I can throw in half a dozen issues here, Brendan. Let me start with the resource allocation. And one and the key and important point in this unproductive relationship is that control over and decision making around in terms of funding and resource allocation and management and use. Unfortunately, the old saying, he who pays as a piper, as they say, calls the tune, remains the reality. The second point is ownership of the work. Who owns the data, the publication, the patenting? That also becomes an issue. And Southern academics continue to lament on the tendency of the Northern academics claiming or taking the lion's share of the initiative. To go back to the term extractive, the Southern academics continue to decry the tendency of the Northern partners only largely probably extracting data information. Probably the third one is agenda setting. Typically, agendas are set without typically sufficient engagement, communication, and appropriate consultation between the North and South partners. Now, it's a common practice to invoke SDGs, by the way. In the case of, for example, Africa Agenda 2063, in terms of agenda setting, but with 17 development goals and 169 targets, you can actually throw in anything and everything in there, and you can still claim to be relevant for the Southern development, the global South. The fourth one I wish to mention, and one heavily and continue to be criticized, is the short-term projects. These short-term projects have very limited lifespan and, of course, very limited impact. They have, however, great implications at an institutional level, in this case, in Southern partners, in terms of time, energy, effort, resources as well. And also, most of these short-term ones do not focus on building infrastructure, equipment, and so forth and so forth. The fifth point I would like to raise is, I think, coming from the field, excessive amount of accountability, reporting, and auditing. That also continues to be one of the issues African Southern institutions in general continue to grapple with. The last point, among many others, but I'll leave it at that, is the kind of domineering leadership role of the global North, and that continues to be a challenge. So the question now is, what are the better ways of partnership? That is where the 10 Global Compact in Research Collaboration, which unveiled recently, GCRC, which has 10 points. I will simply pinpoint a few of them, probably some of them not very well stated or explicitly articulated. The major one I would like to indicate here is investing in a long-term commitment. That's counters the earlier point I made, and that's what it is. And the other one is promote shared leadership. That's also something which I spoke already around it. And the most important part here is probably in institutions, in this case, global South institutions and nations must commit resources to ensure that a better partnership would be achieved. I mean, South Africa is an excellent example in this one. It commits resources toward partnership, so it would be sitting on equal footing when such partnerships happen. So let me leave it as that. Sorry for being long, but simply to say that in terms of the better ways, the Global Compact, which unveiled, speaks to much of the issues I just described. Thank you. Back to you, Brenda.
Thank you, Damtu. Just one quick follow-up question there. When you talked about South Africa putting in money, are you saying that the Southern partners need to put in resources in order to be given a role as a co-leader of the agenda, or should that be happening anyway?
Well, only happens probably in a few countries, which I know of. In the case of Africa, is South Africa, but some other countries like Kenya are also trying to establish similar entities, such as national research foundations, to do that. Yes, just let me put it this way: you can, as I said earlier, it is important for countries to put resources where their mouth is, so that whenever a partner comes in, they would be seated on equal footing. That is something which I wanted to state there.
Thank you, Damtu. Now, Boris, perhaps you could speak to the lessons that you have learned with Engineers Without Borders and how you've been able to switch from a design to build approach to focusing on building local capacity.
Yeah, thanks so much, Brendan. It's remarkable to see the global audience of this podcast. Just wanted to recognize that. It's really nice that people are tuning in from all around the world. I see that in the chat. And the words that Dantu just spoke are like really resonate in terms of the power dynamics, in terms of the archetypes of partnerships. Of course, for the case of Engineers Without Borders USA, we're in the world of taking action and answering basic infrastructure needs in communities around the world, and doing that through partnership. But in the early days of the organization, we made mistakes that everybody makes when entering these types of partnerships without much experience, which is falling into the trap of typical power dynamics, thinking that if you bring the money, then you need to make it, or you can make all of the decisions. And those obviously are pitfalls that don't lead to successful partnerships, don't lead to successful learning, don't lead to successful results at the end of the day. Even if one of the parties in a partnership might feel great about the actions they've taken really profoundly, sometimes the impact can actually be negative. So I would say in delivering successful work and in going through that learning journey as an organization to discover better ways to do this work, we've had to confront and unpack some core tensions of this work. Our volunteers mobilize technical resources, they raise funds to answer the infrastructure needs of communities that request and invite those services and those partnerships. But they do that because one, they can make a difference, and two, because they learn through the process. They're doing real design, build, engineering practice, which is tremendous from a place of learning. And so there's an inherent tension in a way from the learning and the results, because learning. When the organization was founded, it was founded by a civil engineering professor. The primary goal, I would say, was the learning experience of the students involved. So the questions about the local capacity, local partnerships, the long-term results can fall second to the learning experience. So the project failed, but the students learned a lot. So that's successful. Obviously, that's in today's world, and after 25 years of experience, we look at that and say, well, this is completely unacceptable. Of course, that's not enough. So I would say that's kind of one of the elements, is to build systems that truly hold the organization accountable to delivering results, to understanding how to establish partnerships, how to be informed when long-term impact is concerned by the priorities of local organizations that are pursuing their own impact strategy, that have identified areas of focus that are really important to pursue in partnership with local and national governments, so that the work that we do with communities is really inscribed in a broader picture of how impact happens. And what we discover is that when you actually do that, everyone learns from each other, and everyone learns in a much more holistic way about the practice of engineering. So it really is a win-win at the end of the day. But if you do it blindly without critically thinking about your actions, you may think you're learning, and you are learning some things on the technical side, but you're repeating patterns that you're not confronting when it comes to power imbalances and injustices. And it is part of learning to be a good citizen and to be a good engineer, to unpack these other elements. Dantu talked about power dynamics and the question of who brings the money. You use the word domineering, and I would say that sometimes I've actually witnessed dynamics where one group who's bringing the funding to do the work says, well, we're bringing the funding, so we're going to be doing the design because we want to be the ones in charge of designing. And they do that in partnership with local students and local professors in the countries they work. And there is sometimes this negotiation between two professors of engineering who want their students to do the design, one from the US, one from the host country. And this is really just like a lack of imagination, really, because everyone can do the design, everyone can challenge themselves, everyone can actually go, and then we can compare solutions, discuss them. So we can actually, what I've come to realize is that in executing a project cycle, we can actually maximize learning outcomes for everyone, and then maximize quality of engineering results and infrastructure delivery. And these two things are not actually in opposition. They're only in opposition in our own minds if we don't take the time to really talk to each other and to establish an equitable partnership. But this is really the lowest common denominator if we do that. There's plenty of opportunities to do this work well, to do it right. It's just a matter of taking time to recognize and to understand the deeper dynamics of the partnerships we establish.
That was very interesting. So are you saying that it's essential to have a method to co-define the problem and co-design the solution?
I would say in order to, kind of do a good job at the end of the day of establishing your partnerships and doing this work, multiple elements need to be in place. One is a structure, not just for the project delivery, but a structure for the partnership, for establishing partnership. And those are different kind of skill sets. And so we've had to build our team to make sure that this was actually done well, and invest the resources for that, including supporting our local partners financially as a core, providing core funding to their capacity so that they can, engage with us as equals. But the other part is also just organizational culture. What expectations do we set? What stories do we tell? How do we interact, and how do we arrange the interactions? I think in the early days of Engineers Without Borders USA, the partners would be invited to our national conference and to hear about the students' projects. Today, they're invited to our conference so that the students can hear from their impact strategies and their leadership in their own context. So it changes the dynamic of the conversation and who's learning from whom.
Thank you, Boris. So Michael, as CEO of ABET, you're all about raising standards, and some of your partnerships are about doing that in different countries. What are the better ways of running partnerships from your point of view?
Yeah, thanks, Brendan, for that question. ABET, we're all about quality in education, and specifically higher education in the STEM fields, engineering, computing, applied natural sciences. And so, we have a lot of relationships around the world. And I think, Dantu kind of hit on one of his things that he kind of talked about was transactional, and that being sort of an impediment to really making progress. And I feel, in our case, that's not what we're doing. I have some slides here. I was going to ask to maybe just pop those up there and kind of give a summary of some of the ways that we are actually engaged internationally. We have a number of formal and informal sort of arrangements. We have like memorandum of understanding. We have accords, which are sort of binding relationships as a way to kind of improve the quality of higher ed around the world collectively. So we don't do that alone. We have standards. Other countries have standards. We agree on what those standards are going to look like, and then we pull those up and put those forward. And those are kind of our standards, our criteria that individual STEM programs have to meet in order to be successful. Quality is kind of a nice thing, because really what we're after is developing a culture of quality. It's not just something that you buy from us. For example, you can't buy quality from ABET and then sort of implement it in your program. So we're good. It's something that is learned. It's something that develops over time. And I think we're in a nice position to help programs and institutions around the world develop their own quality systems, because they are their programs. It's their institutions. They're the ones that know how to manage it best. And I guess having the ability to do that, I think, is very satisfying. And again, we do this collaboratively. Like all these agreements that we have, whether they're formal or informal, those relationships are two ways. So we learn a lot because people are different everywhere. They have different experiences, cultural experiences. They, depending upon maybe geographic changes and historical and so forth. So things are different all around the world. And I know Boris mentioned a little bit of learning in that regard, and I know some actual specific Engineers Without Border kind of stories about that whole thing. But point being is, it's always a two-way exchange. One of the other things that I think is really important also is, internationalizing our own organization. And so we have a staff of about 45, but then we have this huge core of what we call our evaluators and the people that do the reviews, well over 2,000, and a good number of them now come from different parts of the world. So the idea there is to build the relationships sort of organically, internally, even because, again, we're going to get perspectives. We're going to understand how education is conducted, maybe some what the challenges, opportunities, all those things are around the world, and we're going to get those best through our relationships with our own evaluators, our own volunteers. The last thing I would say is, we're also plugged into a lot of international organizations, from like the European Engineering sort of organization, CEFI, to the Lemelson Foundation, which is in the U.S. and focus really on building a sustainable world through, making sure students have knowledge, skills, abilities in the sustainability area, sustainable design, to International Federation of Engineering Organizations, to the World Federation of Engineering Organizations, to UNESCO, and so forth. So there's all these organizations, and I think being part of that, even we're not drivers in most of those areas, but being there, establishing valued relationships, understanding perspectives, all of that I think is critically important to building strong, meaningful, and impactful relationships, especially in the north-south area.
Thank you, Michael. Sorry, your slides don't seem to have appeared, so apologies for that. But perhaps you could just give us a specific example of one or two things that you've learned from Africa or India from your partners working with them. Have they been able to help you improve your own criteria, for instance?
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's comforting in some ways to me to see that there's a lot of commonality. Okay, and I know that, for example, we have a set of standards called the graduate attributes, which have been adopted by 26 different countries through our Accord partnerships, and those are co-developed by input from everyone. And there were some aspects that of that in terms of what we call some essential skills like communication, teamwork, ethics, all those kinds of topics that in some cases are a little bit more difficult to implement than others, as opposed to the technical skills that people often think of. Well, you have an engineering undergraduate program or a computer science program or get a natural science program, and what the focus is going to be on the technical aspect. But it's really the people part is the challenge, right? Trying to get people to work together to kind of achieve some meaningful results. And so I think getting that input and working with, again, different people from all over the world, north, south, east, west, basically every continent with the exception of Antarctica, I suppose, is hugely beneficial, because we live on one planet. We have common problems. We have big common problems, right? With everything from managing our climate to everything in water supplies and everything in between, and those are only going to be achieved, through a global effort. And so, I think having everyone kind of weigh in and agree and kind of move forward on that is been hugely beneficial.
Thank you, Michael. Ernest, could you tell us some of the lessons you've learned and how some of the answers are being pursued in the African Research Charter, for instance, and the current drive for research partnerships between Africa and the EU?
Thank you very, very much. Thank you for inviting me to join this panel. So far, I've enjoyed what I've heard, and I agree with most of what has been said. The one thing I've learned is the fact that for any partnership to be effective, for any partnership to be equal, it has to be intentional about it. So many of the things that we've seen over the last several decades in terms of partnerships with higher education have been quite unequal because they were never intended to be equal. I can give examples from my own research experience. I can give examples from being in higher education all these years. The one thing that strikes me as running through many of the things I saw in my earlier years as a researcher, as a research manager, was the fact that many of the things that we did as researchers in our institutions, in our universities, were initiated from outside. And because they were initiated from outside, often had very little contribution from us in terms of making it the way it should be. And that's something that Damtu mentioned. but which we are striving very hard to change, and I think it's changing. In the early years when I was a researcher, I would typically sit in my office at the University of Ghana, and somebody would walk in from a UK university or a US university and say, I have this big grant to do this work in this area, and would you like to partner with me? And of course, I wanted to partner with him or her. If I didn't do that, it would mean going for several years without a grant. And so we did that. And the more we engaged with researchers from other countries and so on, the more opportunity we had for publishing. So without these people coming and saying, I have a grant, can you partner with me? There was nothing happening in many universities. And that's something that through ARUA we've tried to change. How do you ensure that African researchers can sit in their universities and not have to wait for someone to come and say, I have a grant, would you partner with me? That is the thing that must change. ARUA was created as a mechanism for empowering young African researchers so they would have some of the resources, so they will have some voice, so they have some skill, so they have some governance experience in going into partnerships. It was a way of ensuring that when there was need for a partnership in higher education, that the African partners were skilled, that they knew what it's about. They had the right answers to the various questions that were at stake. And that is something I was happy to hear Boris talk about, capacity building and so on. Yes, it's important for us that the Africans went about building their own capacity in a very structured way. And that's what ARUA is about and has been about for the past decade. So when we began ARUA, we wanted to establish a system where African universities engaged with their European partners as equals. They were part of the thing that basically involved in a co-creation of a project. They asked the questions together. The questions were relevant to their environment. They designed the studies together. They participate fully, and they analyzed the data together and wrote the reports together. That's what we were always seeking to achieve. It took a long time, largely because many of the Africans in the initial stage were not prepared for that. Through various initiatives, through having these centers of excellence in the 13 universities, ARUA has managed to improve that. I must also say that in some of the earlier years, African universities did not focus much on how to manage research projects. And so it was always easy to argue for the management of these collaborative projects to be housed in the UK or in Europe or in North America. That today, almost every African university has a well-trained office for managing projects. And this has helped to improve the standing of these universities, has helped to improve their capacity to engage with various external bodies. One of the things I've learned very hard, very difficult, has been the fact that the management of universities for a long time was very not properly structured in many countries. Today, that has changed. In most African countries, I see that there's a more professional approach to the management of universities and also other research institutions. This has made it a lot easier for them to engage with their partners from the global north. What this has led to is what today we call the clusters of research excellence that bring African and European universities together. Through these clusters of research excellence, and there are about 23 of them, all between European universities and African universities. There are 23 of them looking at various themes that have been jointly selected, looking at research approaches that have been jointly agreed on, looking at questions that reflect their relevance to Africa. So today, whether it's in climate change or in migration or in non-communicable diseases, you are bringing researchers from different parts of Europe and different parts of Africa together who discuss and agree on research questions, who discuss and agree on methodology, who discuss and agree on the policy relevance of what they are doing. And that, for me, has made a very, very big difference. The African Charter is a way of formalizing all these developments. The African Charter is an initiative that started with the Perivoli African Research Center in Bristol, has in partnership with Arua and the AAU and other universities. Today, it has probably formalized the thinking of how these partnerships should be structured. Today, it has formalized how co-creation can be originated. It has formalized the way management of research projects can be done to ensure equity. As I said from the beginning, making sure that there's an equitable research initiative or partnership requires an intentional approach. The parties must be intentional. It's not going to happen by chance. And I like the points that Boris made about planning for it, ensuring that it gets done. When the parties are quite firm and they are intentional about making sure that the partnerships are equitable, it will be reflected in the structure. It will be reflected in who gets to do what. It will be reflected in the leadership of the initiative, whether if they are PIs, that they come from both the north and the south. But there was always the fear that once you brought these PIs from the south, you have to manage them carefully. You have to more or less lead them. No, today I see many, many competent PIs in the region who are capable of leading large projects that go across different borders and have done so excellently over the years. So I'm very confident that we've learned a lot from the experience of the 70s and 80s. Today, in 2026, those experiences, those difficult years have taught us how to do collaboration much better. They've taught us how to ensure that partnerships benefit all the parties involved. They've taught us how to ask relevant questions, and they've taught us how to do rigorous research. The main reason for entering into any partnership is to ensure that we learn from each other. That's the main reason. The global north has a lot to learn from the global south, and the global south has a lot to learn from the global north. If a partnership is not well structured, they don't learn from each other. And that will be a major cost to the whole initiative. Thank you.
Thank you, Ernest. That's really interesting, and I'm just wondering, how much of a mind shift there had to be from the European side, for instance, in that partnership to shift away from the kind of donor mentality, as you say, of the 80s and 90s, and have they actually got to the stage where they're now inviting African researchers to come and help solve problems in Europe?
Yeah, most of what we saw in the 80s, 90s clearly was driven by the way the funding was structured. So that when they thought about making it more equitable, what you saw was, let's say, a UK funding institution, can be FCDO or it's a DFID, give a grant and say, we want you to have a southern partner. And so the southern partner then gets invited. Then the criteria for selecting the southern partner were never transparent. People got selected likely because they were known by the northern initiators. Today, what we at Arua did was to go to UKRI and say, look, why don't we restructure that kind of a plan where the proposals that you consider will originate from the southern partners? And it made a very big difference. So instead of somebody coming from Liverpool to look for a partner in Ghana, somebody from Ghana went to Liverpool and said, look, we are going to UKRI for this grant. Are you interested in partnering with us? And that made a huge difference.
Thank you. Interesting. Really interesting discussion. So let's move now to look at our second poll question, which is about the types of, it's not showing here, but it's about what type of north-south partnership are you involved in primarily? And perhaps if you can just check through the list and tick it off, it will give us an idea of the types of partnerships that you're involved in. And meanwhile, we'll move to the second question, which is how do you manage risk, build capacity and establish long-term viability in a partnership involving two very different contexts? What are the key ways you do that? And this time I'm going to start with Boris.
Well, I think one of the major, like the partnership, actually, the capacity of the partners that we work with is a critical aspect of managing risk. From Denver, Colorado, where our head office is located, or any of the universities or professional or the cities where professionals are involved in our work on a volunteer basis, we cannot assess multidimensional risks of the projects that we work with. We obviously have our own staff, looking at health and safety risks and these types of elements, but ultimately the success of all of the work we do depends on the smarts, the focus, the attention of the partners that we work with, and so we simply listen to their priorities and listen to their direction when it comes to where to act, where to do our work. And we build by co-building the work that we do with our partners, who themselves are also bridging differences between, being in the capital city versus being in rural areas. There's also power dynamics and resource differences there. They come in with the engineering know-how in places where it's not as available. So these power dynamics are really everywhere in the work that we do, and so they also have to be very competent in engaging with communities, local municipalities, engaging and ensuring local ownership. There's like the story of rural infrastructure is filled with stories of failures, of things that are built without the proper operations and maintenance and capacity of the communities to even afford it. And so engaging with the community as equals in a partnership that is where the goal of building together is also shared, so that there's almost like a Russian doll of partnership success that needs to be built at all levels. And I would say that takes care of a majority of the risk, to make sure that what we do is appropriate, is desired, is going to be utilized, is owned by the communities that we work with, is inscribed within a broader strategy built with local leadership and built with including local institutions and like the government, so that there is quality at the community level, there's quality in the partnership between those involved in doing the work, and there's quality of contribution to an overall national strategy.
Thank you, Boris. Michael, it must be very complicated managing, trying to achieve common standards across different, political and cultural contexts. What are the risks involved?
Well, it kind of depends on what we're doing. Like, as I mentioned, we have some informal agreements to kind of work on improving standards, improving the quality of education. Globally, we have formal agreements, and then we actually have some, accreditation activities in different parts of the world as well. And so, I guess kind of underlying all of that is, we certainly don't want to, go anywhere or participate in any way if we're not genuinely welcomed. And how that kind of transitions to this discussion is, there are certain places that have organic or national regional accrediting systems. And so, we want to make sure that if we come in there and, credit programs at a particular institution, that those systems don't have an issue with that. In most cases, that's never the case. So that's kind of one of the basics. But, from a practical point of view, we always have, as we're sending people around the world, we always look at the health and the safety and all those kind of things that kind of Boris just mentioned. But also, I think it really does get down to relationships and again, back to this kind of notion of transaction or making transactional relationships. We want to stay away from that. I mean, we are genuinely, the core values of ABET is all built upon, making the world a better place. And we do that by ensuring students, when they graduate, have all the knowledge, skills, abilities, to make a difference in the world. And that's changed significantly, I think, at least in my lifetime, from when I was an undergraduate student. Graduating from school was exciting and all that, got my engineering degree. But it was at that time, it was really about, making sure you had the right technical solution, the technical skills, and a little bit about economics in terms of what it's cost to come up with solutions. Now students are looking at, completely, not completely different, but, a whole new set of constraints, like what's the cultural impact, the social impact, will it work in certain parts of the world? What about the environmental impact? So important now, of course, ethical implications, all those kinds of things. And so as a standard setting organization, those are actually called out in our standards now. And again, we have many of our partners, especially the ones in the courts, those are all required as well. And so I think it comes down to really, trust. And again, trust is not something that you purchase. Trust is not something that you get by flying somewhere and coming home. It's built over some time. And I think, again, we're all in the same boat in terms of what we're trying to achieve. Improving the quality of education is a real essential and noble and important concept. I mean, supports economies. It's something that's in demand everywhere, and so being part of that is really in a good. I feel very privileged to be in that space, I suppose. But again, I think my experience over 15 years working at ABET. At the end of the day, it's all about people. I kind of mentioned that earlier, and working with people, getting the trust, and and it's always a two-way conversation, two-way street. We're not going to exploit anything. We're going to help where we can. And again, I think at the end of the day, building those personal relationships is critical to making progress.
Thank you, Ernest. Perhaps you could give a global South perspective, especially on what the risks that you have to manage.
Clearly, my experience, there was always the fear that a large organization like USAID or FCDU, Gates, give a university in Africa a grant to do work on malaria, and the money wouldn't be used properly for that, and there would be no accountability. That was the commonest type of risk that was always sort of in the cast. Today, I think a lot of that has changed or is changing, and it's coming as a result of many years of experience and a response to that at different levels. In your average African country today, governments have taken a keen interest in research and its management. Not at the level that we really want to see governments do far more than they are doing. But in almost every country, there's an institution that has been set up to regulate the conduct of research. That provides some kind of provides standards that researchers, institutions and their researchers must adhere to. It's a very, very important thing. So in South Africa, for example, what we've seen done in many South African universities is largely a result of what the NRF is doing. It provides some kind of insurance for those who do the research and those who support the research. Many African countries are trying to replicate the NRF in their own countries, and that I think is a great idea. And then below the national level, you have institutions, the universities, the research institutions, and so on. They must have arrangements in place to mitigate risk. As I said in my earlier presentation, most universities today have a research office, a research management office, which was not there some 10, 15 years ago. That has helped researchers to feel more secure. That has helped to free them from doing management as well as doing the research itself. That provides the assurance that the institution backs whatever you're doing. So there's no likelihood of Gates coming looking for how their money has been used and no one there to account for it. Today, that is very much taken care of. And then the third level where the risk has to be is at the level of researchers. To what extent do they have the assurance, and are they willing to stick their own credibility on the line for delivering good work? It's unlike in the past where people were very much focused on how much money was coming to them. Increasingly, I see a lot more attention being paid to what type of publications are we going to get? Where can we publish? Will that publication be available to people in the global south? Will our governments be able to use the publication. So these are things that have changed and I think it reduced considerably the risk involved in supporting research in Africa, in conducting research in Africa. Things are changing. There are still areas where there's still some significant amount of risk involved, but I think by large, most of it is gone. Most of it is gone, and a lot more needs to be done. Governments need to be more interested. Governments need to be more assured of what they want, and then need to support by putting more money into research.
Thank you. Damtu, would you like to add to what Ernest says, and maybe perhaps you could comment a bit on...
Brendan, you are muted.
Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon. Yes. Okay. Thank you. Sorry about that. Yeah, Damtu, perhaps you could add to that, and perhaps comment also on how you manage the risks that evolve out of geopolitical tensions. You know, because different countries come calling, trying to help, trying to work with African researchers. You know, what are the risks involved from different geopolitical spheres?
Thank you, Brendan. I'm struggling to stay away from following up with some of the issues that are raised here.
Okay.
You know, it happens, of course, as a student of this topic, it's expected that I would have a lot to say, but I'm trying to contain myself. But the point here is, I think it is important to appreciate that a more democratic and progressive partnerships have existed. In fact, one of the good examples are Nordic countries. Norway and Sweden, etc., have had this for a long time. It is that some other countries, without naming these countries here, have been very slow, but they are slowly coming into the picture. But I think it's also important to appreciate that the kind of the global cooperation partnership dynamics has dramatically changed. So that might also have an impact in terms of where we are heading. So let me just throw that in as I wish to respond to that question you just put in. In terms of the risk issue, I sit in a number of panels reviewing research proposals, grants, etc. One of the most common questions that are being asked are, what are the risk issues in delivering in this particular project, for example? So these questions are so common, and institutions struggle to actually respond and to this question, and in a way anticipate and predict those risks are. So this, let me just say this: as we talk about risk, a partnership is a relationship, and a relationship always has a risk. You need to invest trust. I think Michael, took the word out of my mouth. That trust is one of the key elements in a relationship. Another one is a commitment to this relationship. Do you have the energy? Do you have the institutional? We talked about the infrastructure and so forth, which Ernest talked about, and also I think Boris talked about. So these are the things which we need to take into account while we are weighing the matter of risk. The good thing is that, fortunately, most partnerships, they grow and they thrive and they succeed. But as many also stumble and fail for a number of reasons. And one of which is, for example, political issues. Particularly in the global south, we have conflict, and what's happening in much of Africa in terms of conflict. So this become an issue. And that, unfortunately, kind of paints a wrong picture that is Africa. For many who continue to doubt in African research, African partnership, that picture emanates from some of these realities in that picture. So there are political tensions, there are autonomy issues, institutional autonomy. There is also issues of academic freedom. You have leadership and management dynamics in terms of these partnerships and the frictions and so forth. I think, in my view, there is always that risk that lurks around, but kind of through, I think, I was out for a few minutes. I don't know what to say there, but let me just say if it is repeated, I'm sorry. You need to have a seasoned leadership. I think it's so important. And of course, the structure we talked about. And it's also important to have frequent, open, and in-person interactions. All these three are very important. Virtual is as good as it is virtual. And it must also be a genuine interest on the part of the partners to understand and appreciate the context, the issues, the opinions of colleagues and partners. I think these are the key issues which I would like to intimate around these issues of risk. Risk exists. You can only anticipate those risks. And then, of course, you have to also intimate possible scenarios to address that particular risk, upon which actually we review these proposals closely. Back to you, Brandon.
Thank you, Damtu. And we're going to now just have a quickly look at the results of our second poll, which interestingly shows that about 20% of your partnerships and the audience are involved in are primarily about capacity building, compared to 32% for research partnerships, for instance. I actually think that's probably quite a positive sign. I'm not sure what you would expect to find there, but it's not a big sample, but an indication perhaps. So let's move to our third poll. How deep is your North-South partnership, and which of the following characteristics apply? So we picked out some characteristics, and you can just tick all that apply, and then we'll come back to that later. Meantime, we're going to speed up a little because we've got 2 questions to get through before we get to the audience Q&A. So we're going to move quickly on to question 3 about what are the unique opportunities that North-South partnerships bring for innovation in staff development and especially student education. For instance, in what way are the challenges addressed by the partners really helpful in giving students the soft skills and meaningful real-world experience that employers are all saying that they really want to see, and that is perhaps not prevalent enough in higher education currently? And does this actually create a business case for funding such partnerships? I'm going to start with Michael.
Okay, Brendan. Yeah, very good question. And I think, it's great that we have our colleagues here from Africa, because one of the things that we've been looking at is the African continent in general has the largest in terms of demographics. I think the largest number of young learners, students, potential students available in the world. And the challenge has kind of been that it's not consistent everywhere, where you might have the infrastructure support higher education in general. And so how do you educate these people that in a way that would be useful? And so certainly distance learning, we learned during COVID that's an option. It can be effective. We did a pretty good job and do a much better job now than we had in the past in terms of how we can reach out and be effective educating students that way. And from a quality point of view, that's something that we care about, and we have programs ourselves that we accredit, they're online, and I would argue that probably every academic program it currently exists has some online component. But how do you really tailor that to students and get students that typically wouldn't have access to education? And there's the other world of credentials. It's just kind of replacing traditional education in some ways. Okay, getting students in some skills that they can then transition into the workforce is important. And how do you do that in a efficient and a quality way? And so I think there's lots of opportunities to kind of innovate in those areas, and that's something that excites me quite a bit.
Let's go to Damtu.
Yes, thank you. In terms of unique opportunities, let me kick off where Michael left off. Take for example, Africa. Still, kind of the enrollment rate is still under 10%. There is a massive need for higher education. Let me actually focus sharply in terms of the question itself. How is it that the North-South partnerships actually bring about addressing this issue through innovation and staff development? For me, it is through doctoral education, because your typical academic that stands in front of a class doesn't have a PhD. In some cases, not even a master's. So there is a huge interest in terms of elevating the capacity of the academics for these institutions that have massively expanded. So I think it's also important to appreciate that not only in Africa, but Asia and Latin America as well, there has been a massive growth in terms of student population, in terms of institutions and so forth, but enough capacity has not been built to actually sustain those institutions in terms of academic, teaching, research, and so forth. So that is where huge opportunities lie. And what is also important here is, kind of like a much broader way, is the fact that the kind of issues, challenges, threats, and opportunities that the world faces. I think we have seen COVID in terms of health, for example. We looked at finance, the 2008 global economic crisis, which we remember. The trade dynamics now, think about the supply of oil and gas in the world. The environment, I think, and climate. I just read the other day that Mexico is actually sinking 10 inches a year. You add to that an AI, add to that migration, the issues of migration, which is very hot in the US and in Europe, and now in the country I live here in South Africa. So these are the global realities which require for nations, regardless of their borders, to actually be able to address these issues and challenges. I think we are now very sure that you cannot live happily in an island of peace and security and tranquility surrounded by all the chaos around the world. So for me, this unique opportunity of partnership lies in the kind of the chaos, challenges, in all the issues I just mentioned here, in addressing that. And back to you, Brendan.
Thank you. Ernest, did you want to chip in? Ernest, did you want to chip in? Okay, we'll go to Boris.
Yeah, thanks. I'll I think build on what Damtu just talked about, and also notice that one of the questions, the Q&A, relates to that a bit. What should be the most important, from Sarah Thompson, what should be the most important motivation for research collaboration for Global South partners, other than a search for funding, and Global North partners, others than having an international experience? And to me, that's like having an impact together. Pursuing a urgent and important agenda for impact is what actually helps people go from self-interest to joined interest. And when you start addressing a really important problem together, then the multiplicity of cultures, perspectives, the international weaving of experiences actually is highly generative of ideas and solutions for innovation. It really is. People see when you're within a culture, there's this thing like, you're a fish in your own water. You don't even realize the water around you. Someone comes from outside and actually sees and feels it differently, and brings into contrast different elements that may be hidden assumptions. And it's also true with people's experience in different technologies and different utilization. Like we learn a lot from East African countries that have adopted mobile money way faster than any European or North American economies. That changes completely the field of innovation. We see it in so basically there's learning both ways and cross-pollination both ways in terms of in that cultural and international exchange. So yeah, a huge driver for innovation. It's done, and in fact, I think you missed out on innovation if you don't define the problem well. If it's just about my own interest to have an international experience, then I will be extractive about it. And if the partner is just there for the money, they're probably going to miss out on the entire learning experience as well.
Thank you, Boris. Ernest, we were having trouble getting you involved. Would you like to answer this question?
I'm sure. I think I missed the question because I couldn't hear you.
Oh, I see. I'm sorry.
Yes,
Well, we were just talking about this question of the what opportunities North-South partnerships bring for innovation in staff development and especially student education, because they these are really rich learning experiences, and the working together and the soft skills involved and the real world experience can really help build capacity in some ways.
Sure. This is the one area that every institution looks forward to making a big difference to its own environment, the infrastructure available to it. The significance of new approaches to learning came very much to the fore during the pandemic. In the course of the pandemic, many universities were forced to learn new ways of engaging with students. Those periods of new learnings made it possible for a number of African universities, for example, to focus more on innovation, focus more on how to bring learning closer to people, take advantage of new technologies. I'm very happy that when I look at the budgets of universities today, they are devoting significant sums to innovation. They are putting significant sums to new technologies. When they go into partnerships, they are always looking for what can we learn from this institution? What new techniques, what new technologies, what new innovations are we going to benefit from this? It has become a major part. I look at several African universities over the years, and it's always amazed me how much effort they are making in this regard, and how they push their global North partners to help them with innovation. I just saw at the University of Ghana a new Center for Innovation started a couple of months ago, and it's supposed to be multidisciplinary, bringing people from different parts of the university together so they can engage with their Northern partners as a joint group, a group that basically has the same intentions, the same objectives, and the same goals. That way of engaging with global partners, Northern partners, I think is one that has been extremely beneficial and will continue to be beneficial.
Thank you, Ernest. And that's a rich variety of answers to that question. So I'm really glad we had that one. But now we're going to look at the answer to the third poll, and we can see that interestingly, about 36% of, we were talking about long-term commitments, about 36% of partnerships our audience are involved in long-term. Nearly half have a formal agreement, and 40% have a jointly agreed impact objective, which obviously isn't a high enough percentage for them to all be effective, but interesting to see. And our last poll, before we go into our question, is poll 4, which is really building on the work that, informed by the work that Damtu has been involved in terms of the Research Compact. It's which of the following 10 principles, which broadly align with the Global Research Compact framework proposal, are already being adopted in your university's approach to North-South partnerships? Just tick the ones, any of them that are being adopted in your partnership. It would be interesting to see what comes out of that. And now we come to question 4, which is how can you ensure that North-South partnerships help to make real progress towards one or more of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which you would think would be quite a natural thing for any North-South partnership. So we're going to start first with Ernest, and perhaps you can talk a bit about how that's working between Africa and Europe.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is something that has engaged many African universities. I was very surprised everywhere I went to the region to find that a certain part of a program was devoted to addressing the SDGs, regardless of the fact that we don't have much time left to achieve the SDGs. What is significant is the fact that universities in the last decade agreed among themselves that the SDGs should be at the core of everything that they do. That's why when ARUA was formed, in creating the 13 centers of excellence, the focus was ensuring that the attainment of the SDGs was the main goal. So in looking for partners in the global north, ARUA was always very deliberate in ensuring that whatever partnerships were being initiated, these would affect the capacity of the universities in Africa to pursue the SDGs, research that will support the SDGs. I remember when I was Secretary General of ARUA, in trying to persuade African governments to support the MDGs, the SDGs, always made the point that you can only attain the SDGs through improved knowledge. And improved knowledge will come from improved research. And improved research will only come from having well-trained researchers. And so ARUA was going to be an instrument for pursuing the new knowledge that would lead to the attainment of the SDGs. We made the point that you're not going to be able to deal with all the food production challenges that affect food security if you didn't use new approaches in growing food, in storing food, in processing food, etc. And that only will come from research. Slowly, governments began to accept it. And so when our researchers wrote proposals looking for northern partners, they always insisted on doing work in areas that they had identified as being relevant to the attainment of the SDGs. I'm happy that today, every African university has groups of researchers or clusters of researchers that are dedicated to one or the other of the SDGs. And they all have partners in the global north. So unlike in the past where people were skeptical about the possibility of achieving SDGs, today I think that there's a growing optimism that even if the country did not attain the SDGs by 2030, the likelihood that there will be a group of people or large groups of people that understood the elements of the SDGs, that understood the requirements for climate change research, that understood the requirements for renewable energy, the requirements for or water conservation, that these things would matter well beyond 2030. And there will be people around who will be able to do long-term research that will be beneficial to their communities.
Thank you, Ernest. And Damtu, perhaps you can tell us a bit about how you think your proposed compact can help achieve the SDGs.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure I'm as optimistic as Ernest is in terms of SDGs. In preparation for this conversation, I looked at the UN report itself in 2025. Remember, as I said earlier, the SDGs comprise 17 goals and 169 targets. And according to the report, only 35% of its targets are on track or making what they call modest gains. Nearly half are progressing too slowly, and sadly, 18% are actually regressing. So in light of this report, I find it very difficult to be that optimistic as Ernest is. Let me also kind of underline the fact that, for example, we have over 1,500 universities in Africa, and many of them are not members of ARUA and are not centers of excellence. So I think I also would like to focus on those institutions and universities who are not, whatever you call them, flagship universities or premier universities, whatever categories we'll put them. I just wanted to make sure that the challenges are much deeper. The situation for most of the institutions is not that rosy. Noting that, I think for me, in this case, SDGs, by the way, SDGs is international. We have also Africa-based one, what is called Agenda 2063 of the African Union Commission. I think it is critical for both the global North and the global South to actually commit resources to actually be able to address all the challenges we talked about. The kind of challenges that are already stated in the SDGs and some of the issues I just raised in terms of climate, poverty reduction, and all that stuff. I think the global North needs to commit, and not only commit, not only pledge, which they have, but actually put the money and the resources behind this initiative. I think equally importantly for me personally, these countries or continents, if you wish, need to put, as was already prescribed, 1% of their GDPs towards research and development. This is very important. In South Africa, where I am based, actually, in fact, of course, South Africa has a much stronger, robust academic institutions and research, and also in terms of economy, much better than the rest of Africa. Even that, this country has not reached that 1%. It's kind of like hovers below 0.8%. That means that the rest of Africa, I would say, does not have actually such resources, which means that much of Africa heavily depends on this, on external resources. So for this North and South partnership to actually make an impact and also achieve progress, it's very important that these countries actually commit resources to research, which is critical and important and key for the partnerships which we are all envisaging. I thought I stated that. I think, however, let me just say this. The New World Order, if you wish to call it also disorder, is such that extant forms of partnerships have become obsolete, in some cases irrelevant and outmoded. A new form, what you just asked specifically, Brendan, a new form, a new model of partnerships, we need to contemplate that, we need to espouse that and advance it in the interest of the entire world and the humankind. Back to you, Brendan.
Thank you, Demtu. And Michael, I'm going to bring you in here, and then we'll bring in Boris. So, Michael, perhaps you could give us examples of how accreditors are delivering on SDGs, and I seem to recall that you've even created a micro-credential on sustainable development yourselves.
Yeah, we have. I feel very strongly, that as an organization, we're making a huge impact in trying to get students and this future workforce all focused on the challenges of sustainable design and sustainability in general. I think the SDGs are awesome, by the way. And I say that because, not that long ago, we talked about this term sustainability. It's a broad topic, means so many different things to different people, that now with the 17 goals, we can actually kind of focus in on some areas, and whether that's students that are passionate about one of the or more of the goals, to just how we instruct students and how we educate them, I think is critically important. I understand Dantu's pessimism. 2030 is not that long away, and we if you look at the scorecards, they don't look good at all. But one of the positives, I think, is that as I've traveled in Africa and other places, I see reference the SDGs. So universally, I think people know what they are, and it allows people to kind of focus energy and time on them. But I think one of our areas we focus on is obviously the fourth, Sustainable Development Goal 4, which is all about education, and 17, which is about partnerships, and that's kind of what we're talking about. We had our big symposium, our big annual event. It was about 750 people just earlier this month. And the whole theme was built around partnerships for purpose, because, I personally believe that a lot of technologies, a lot of the technologies exist already for us to make significant strides in developing a more sustainable world, but getting people to work together, making the commitments, everything we've talked about today, whether it's at the government level, business people, sociologists, engineer, whatever, educators, whatever, it's all going to, require us working together to make significant change. And so while that's straightforward, it's also probably the most challenging, because people tend to be the most challenging in many ways just because of their values and backgrounds and, economic, commitments and change of, lifestyle and all of that, which really is where I think, a lot of change needs to happen. But I think one of the things that ABET's had an opportunity to do is influence, and along with our partners that I mentioned earlier, the core partners, and there is substantive standards and criteria focused on sustainability. And there's one of our slides there. But another example, Lemelson Foundation there in the bottom, it's a private foundation here in the US, and they've committed to helping students, really commit to understanding sustainability in a significant way and then practicing that. So they've developed all kinds of tools and so forth that faculty can use throughout the world at no cost to implement and integrate more sustainability in the undergraduate education from day one all the way through graduation. So I think, while it's, in general, we're not on the right path to achieving the majority of those goals. We are making progress in some, even if it's small. But I think the benefit is the fact that there is focus on it and people are thinking about it. And again, I have great hopes in this next generation of students because they're socially aware. You see it in many cases where, back in my day, people cared about, hey, what kind of job can I get? What am I going to work on? How much money I'm going to get paid, right? There's still some of that, of course, but there's a whole nother part of, hey, what's my impact of my work going to be on the world? And how can I make the world a better place? I'm inheriting this planet. I plan on being here a long time, and how do I make everyone's life better? So I think between focus on the SDGs as a topic in itself and trying to do what we can do to promote both the partnerships as well as just the integration of sustainability in higher education, sustainable design is I think where we are.
Thank you, Michael. And Boris, did you want to chip in on how North-South partnerships can make progress towards the SDGs? I know you've been doing some great work with Engineering Without Borders in Uganda, for instance.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, ultimately, I can testify that, yes, every single partnership has delivered tremendous results for the communities that we work with. Girls that don't have to get up at really early, hours in the morning and fetch water or fetch wood every day. I'm really sensitive to some of the comments that have been made about the urgency and the scale of the challenges. And so even if you have, one-off results and multiple, 350 projects every year that deliver results and deliver learning for the students involved, is that enough? So I would say there's other types of results that EWB has created. One, I'm really proud of the growth of the partners that we've worked with over the years. You mentioned in Uganda, Peter Zabanita, who's the executive director of EWB East Africa based in Kampala, used to be a more junior professional with kind of programmatic coordination experience, and now he's an executive director. He has a team, consequential team of dozens of staff, has a national standing recognized by ministries of health and infrastructure for the work and the track record that he has in the country. And together, we've started looking at how to make the whole of the projects we do together bigger than the sum of the parts, and understanding through innovation and through different, sometimes it's engineering innovation, sometimes it's financial innovations. How can we actually scale these programs to a much greater, national, to move the needle at the national level? So results compound, they add up, track records and capacities grow, and all of that is actually compounding impact towards accelerating towards results. And sometimes, donors want a lot of results immediately, and this may actually push partnerships towards more of like a linear kind of approach where you have to do a lot of things right away and to forget the things that we do that actually compound over the long term. And I do think that equitable partnerships ultimately are compounding partnerships, and they deliver much, much greater impact in the long term. And I'm really proud that EWB USA is part of that sort of class of organizations that do this type of work.
Great. Thank you, Boris. So now we're going to have a look at the results of that poll, which quite interestingly shows that, well, the one aspect of the compact that partnerships most have is aligning collaboration with local priorities, which is a great thing. So also quite a few diversified collaboration partners and networks, and there's quite a significant number who foster ethical and responsible research practices, which is hopeful. There's some data there for Damtu to digest. But now we're going to go to our audience questions, and it's interesting what you were saying about funding there, Boris, and I'm just trying to get, oh no, Q&A, right, sorry. Because Sabrina from the Bavarian Research Alliance has asked the question, that's in Germany. I would like to ask what not only researchers and organizations who carry out the research can do to make partnerships more equitable, but what also funding agencies can do. Who would like to answer that one? Damtu?
Thank you. On the account of my experience sitting in these panels, the funding institutions play a very strong role in ensuring it. One, for example, in terms of leadership, is it going to be led, is it going to be co-led, or who is going to be the principal investigator? So that is one of the issues that needs to be funders can insist on. The second one is how much of a resource is going to the southern partner vis-a-vis the northern partner. That also could easily be established through these mechanisms. So these are 1 and 2 and 3 issues these funding institutions insist on as they are releasing the documents for the proposals. I thought this would be an important one.
Anyone else want to chip in there? Ernest?
One of the things that we managed to negotiate with the UKRI before the more recent collapse was to get the UKRI to sign on to the African Charter, basically ensuring that all proposals that came to it from various entities in the UK for support showed that they were ready to adhere to the principle of equitable partnerships. And we had sort of agreed to this, and UKRI was going to sign on to it. We had several discussions. So effectively, we have making one of the largest funders of research in Africa a party to the charter. Similarly, we approached the European Union. It's not a signatory yet, but a large number of European universities have signed on to it. So this is going to put pressure on the European Union to begin to consider the charter, the African Charter, as the yardstick for engaging, the yardstick for measuring the commitment of universities to equitable partnerships. And I think it's one of the things that we can do. Once funders begin to think in a very structured way about supporting partnerships in an equitable manner, and let this reflect in the criteria they use for assessing various grant applications and so on, I think a major obstacle will be removed.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question from Rosanna. I don't know where you are, Rosanna, but you ask, how could universities actually navigate all the different guidelines, and how does one evaluate a partnership to say this is an equitable and responsible partnership? Boris, would you like to answer that one?
Yeah, I saw the questions that are sort of related to the same, same domain, and they made me realize that for us, it's been really kind of a learning process. We haven't ground-proofed our own partnership structure on kind of any globally established frameworks. And I think someone talked about economic reconciliation as well. I think, you know, the principles behind which we do and build our partnerships needs to be a little bit more explicit, maybe through a policy that right now is really just like exists through the practices of the organization. So that's it's an interesting takeaway from me on this panel, is that, you know, sharing what we learn about establishing equitable partnerships and seeking out kind of frameworks, or maybe even participating in establishing, you know, through conversation and through exchange, you know, updating existing frameworks might be an interesting endeavor for the future.
Thank you. And I'm afraid, I'm really sorry, Michael, but we're just running out of time. So I think we're just I'm going to conclude now. But this has been a really interesting discussion and valuable contributions from all our speakers. So as we've heard today, building truly effective North-South partnerships isn't just about good intentions. It requires trust, shared ownership, deep relationships, accountability, a commitment to co-defining problems and co-defining solutions, and being in it for the long term. So my thanks to our panelists, Boris, Damtu, Ernest and Michael, for such a rich and insightful discussion. And thank you again to ABET, especially for partnering with us on this series. And thank you to everyone who joined us and contributed your thoughts and questions from around the world. We'll be continuing this webinar series in June with another discussion on issues shaping higher education. So do keep an eye out for details. And a recording of this webinar will be shared with all our registered participants and will also be available on the University World News YouTube channel. So thank you for joining us, and we look forward to continuing the conversation in future.